January 10th, 2016, midnight in New York City. Somewhere in a quiet apartment in Soho, David Bowie turned 69 years old. His family gathered around him, his wife Iman, his children, a handful of close friends. There was no big party, no celebrity crowd, no photographers. Just candles, cake, and the people he loved most. David smiled. He laughed. He made jokes. He was happy. 2 days earlier, he'd released his 25th studio album, Blackstar. It was strange, haunting, beautiful, filled with jazz horns and cryptic lyrics about death and transformation. Critics called it his best work in decades. Fans were mesmerized. No one knew what it really meant. No one knew it was a farewell. 2 days after his birthday, on January 11th, 2016, David Bowie died. Cancer. Liver cancer, to be specific, though he'd kept it secret for 18 months. He'd recorded Blackstar knowing he was dying. He'd planned his final album as a parting gift to the world, a work of art about mortality and legacy and letting go. And then, quietly, without fanfare, without saying goodbye, he slipped away. The world was stunned. David Bowie, the man of 1,000 faces, the Starman, the Thin White Duke, Ziggy Stardust, was gone. How could someone so alive, so endlessly inventive, so seemingly immortal, simply vanish? Welcome to Story Factory. I'm here to take you back through the lives of the stars who shaped our memories, the voices that filled our radios, the artists who made us see the world differently. Today, we're opening the story of David Bowie and the man behind 1,000 faces, how he transformed pain, identity, and the fear of death into art, and how his final album became the most beautiful goodbye in music history. This isn't just a story about rock and roll. It's a story about reinvention, about courage, about an artist who never stopped changing, never stopped creating, even when he knew time was running out. Let's go back to the beginning. London, England, 1947. The war was over, but the scars remained. Buildings were bombed out, food was rationed, families were broken. On January 8th, in the working-class neighborhood of Brixton, a boy named David Robert Jones was born. His mother, Peggy, worked as a cinema usher. His father, Haywood, was a promotions officer for a children's charity. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable, respectable, ordinary. David wasn't ordinary. From the time he was a child, David was different. He was artistic, sensitive, fascinated by music and theater. He learned to play the ukulele, then the saxophone. He devoured Little Richard and Elvis Presley records. He watched his older half-brother, Terry, who introduced him to jazz, Buddhism, and beat poetry. Terry was brilliant, charismatic, troubled. He suffered from schizophrenia, cycling in and out of psychiatric hospitals. David adored him, and he feared him. Because if Terry could lose his mind, maybe David could too. That fear of madness, of losing himself, would haunt David Bowie his entire life. It would shape his music, his art, his constant reinvention. If you keep changing, if you never settle into one identity, maybe the madness can't catch you. At 13, David got into a fistfight with a school friend over a girl. The friend's fingernail scratched David's left eye, permanently damaging the pupil. For the rest of his life, David's left eye would appear darker, wider, giving him an otherworldly, alien look. It became one of his most distinctive features. The boy from Brixton was already starting to look like someone not quite of this world. By the mid-1960s, David was obsessed with becoming a star. He formed bands, changed his name to David Bowie, after the Bowie knife, something sharp and memorable. Recorded singles that went nowhere. He tried folk, rock, mod, novelty songs. Nothing stuck. In 1967, he released The Laughing Gnome, a silly children's song with sped-up voices. It flopped. David was 20 years old, broke, frustrated, watching the Beatles and the Stones conquer the world while he remained unknown. Then came 1969, Space Oddity. The song was released just days before the Apollo 11 moon landing, a haunting ballad about an astronaut named Major Tom floating in his tin can, far above the world, losing contact with ground control. It was eerie, melancholic, beautiful. It became a hit. Finally, after years of failure, David Bowie had a song people remembered. But it wasn't enough. One hit single didn't make you a star. David needed something bigger, something no one had ever seen before. In 1971, David met a young guitarist named Mick Ronson and a producer named Tony Visconti. Together, they started working on a concept. What if David created a character, an alien rock star sent to Earth to save humanity through music? What if he didn't just sing the songs, he became the character, lived as him, performed as him, made the audience believe he was real? In 1972, David Bowie introduced the world to Ziggy Stardust. Ziggy was everything David wasn't: confident, flamboyant, sexually ambiguous, otherworldly. He had flame-red hair, wore platform boots and glittering jumpsuits, painted his face with lightning bolts. He moved like a creature from another planet. And when he sang songs like Starman and Suffragette City and Rock and Roll Suicide, it felt like witnessing something revolutionary. Glam rock was born, and David Bowie became a superstar. But Ziggy was dangerous. The more David inhabited the character, the more he lost himself. Fans didn't want David, they wanted Ziggy. The press didn't interview David, they interviewed Ziggy. Even David's friends started treating him like the alien rock star, not the boy from Brixton. The line between performance and reality began to blur. In 1973, at the height of Ziggy's fame, David did something shocking. He killed him. On stage at the Hammersmith Odeon in London, in front of thousands of fans, David announced, "This is the last show we'll ever do." The crowd gasped. Ziggy Stardust was dead. David Bowie needed to move on before the character consumed him completely. He moved to America. He created new personas: Aladdin Sane, the Halloween Jack, the Thin White Duke, each one more extreme, more theatrical, more detached from reality. And behind the masks, David was falling apart. He was using cocaine heavily, barely eating, surviving on peppers and milk, descending into paranoia. He became obsessed with the occult, with UFOs, with fascism. The Thin White Duke era was David at his most hollow, most dangerous. He was so far inside his characters, he couldn't find his way out. In 1976, David did something that saved his life. He moved to Berlin. West Berlin in the late 70s was a strange, divided city, half free, half trapped behind the Iron Curtain. It was cheap, anonymous, gritty. David rented an apartment with his friend Iggy Pop, another rock star trying to escape addiction and fame. They lived like ordinary people. They rode bicycles, they went to art galleries, they painted, and slowly, quietly, David began to heal. In Berlin, David recorded 3 albums that would define his legacy: Low, Heroes, and Lodger, the Berlin trilogy. The music was experimental, cold, beautiful, influenced by German electronic bands like Kraftwerk. Heroes became an anthem about love and defiance in the face of impossible odds. The image of David singing in front of the Berlin Wall became iconic. Berlin saved David Bowie. It gave him back his sanity, his creativity, his soul. By the 1980s, David was ready to conquer the mainstream. Let's Dance was released in 1983, a slick, polished pop album produced by Nile Rodgers. It was David's biggest commercial success, selling millions of copies, dominating MTV. He played stadiums. He became a global icon. But something was missing. The music felt safe, calculated, soulless. David had become so successful he'd lost his edge. The late 80s and 90s were uneven for David. Some albums worked, some didn't. He experimented with industrial rock, drum and bass, even formed a band called Tin Machine that critics hated. But David didn't care. He was still searching, still reinventing, still refusing to stay in one place. Then in 1992, David married Iman, a Somali-American supermodel. She was elegant, intelligent, grounded. She loved David, not Bowie the rock star. For the first time in his life, David felt truly seen. They had a daughter, Alexandria, in 2000. David became a father again. He already had a son, Duncan, from his first marriage. And something shifted. David stopped chasing fame. He stopped needing to prove himself. He just wanted to live, to be present, to be happy. He still made music, but on his own terms. Albums came when they came. He performed when he felt like it. In 2006, he suffered a heart attack on stage during a concert in Germany. It scared him. He slowed down even more. By 2010, David Bowie had essentially retired. No new music, no tours, just life with Iman in Alexandria in New York City. The world assumed he was done, that the star man had finally come down to earth and decided to stay. But David had one more transformation left. In 2014, David was diagnosed with liver cancer. He told almost no one, just Iman, his children, his closest collaborators. He didn't want pity. He didn't want a public farewell tour, tabloid headlines, the indignity of being watched as he weakened. Instead, he decided to do what he'd always done, turn pain into art. He began working on Blackstar, an album about mortality, legacy, and letting go. He collaborated with a jazz ensemble, creating dark, complex, haunting music. The lyrics were filled with images of death, skulls, candles, graves, ascension. The opening track, Blackstar, featured the line, "Something happened on the day he died. Spirit rose a meter and stepped aside." It was a farewell, a final gift, a work of art crafted in the shadow of death. The album was released on January 8, 2016, David's 69th birthday. The music video for Blackstar showed a dead astronaut, a clear reference to Major Tom. Another video for Lazarus showed David lying in a hospital bed, blindfolded, singing, "Look up here, I'm in heaven." The clues were there, but no one understood. Not until 2 days later, when the news broke, David Bowie had died. The world mourned. Tribals appeared outside his New York apartment, outside his childhood home in Brixton. Fans left flowers, candles, handwritten notes. Musicians covered his songs. Radio stations played his music nonstop. Social media filled with tributes. Everyone had a David Bowie song that meant something to them. Space Oddity, Life on Mars, Heroes, Starman, Let's Dance, Changes. Maybe you remember the first time you saw David Bowie on television. The hair, the makeup, the costumes that made you stop and stare. Maybe you remember dancing to Let's Dance at a wedding or crying to Heroes during a breakup. Maybe you remember feeling like an outsider, like you didn't fit in, and hearing Rebel Rebel or Ziggy Stardust and realizing that being different wasn't something to hide, it was something to celebrate. David Bowie gave us permission to be ourselves, to change, to reinvent, to refuse to be pinned down by other people's expectations. He showed us that you didn't have to be one thing your whole life. You could be many things. You could be everything. And in the end, David Bowie taught us how to say goodbye. Blackstar wasn't a cry for help or a plea for sympathy. It was an artist taking control of his final narrative, crafting his last act with the same creativity and courage he'd shown his entire life. He didn't let cancer write his ending. He wrote it himself. Iman, in the months after his death, spoke rarely of her grief. But when she did, she spoke of a man who faced death with grace, who never complained, who worried more about his family than himself. He was a wonderful husband, she said, and he was a wonderful father. That's what mattered most to him at the end. David Bowie's legacy is everywhere, in every artist who refuses to stay in one lane, in every musician who experiments, who takes risks, who creates characters and worlds, in every person who looks at the world and says, "I don't fit in," and then realizes that not fitting in is the whole point. He was the Starman, the Thin White Duke, Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane. But most of all, he was David Robert Jones from Brixton, a boy who feared madness, who feared being forgotten, who spent his whole life transforming fear into beauty. Rest in peace, David Bowie. You gave us the stars. You gave us permission to change. And in the end, you showed us how to leave with dignity, with art, with one final gift that will echo forever. Before we close, a brief note. This story is based on publicly available information, interviews, biographies, and David's own words in documentaries. Some conversations and small details have been dramatized to bring his journey to life, but the heart of his story, his artistry, his struggles, his transformation, and his graceful farewell is real. If this story brought back memories, if David's music was part of your life the way it was part of mine, consider subscribing to Story Factory. We're here to revisit the legends who lit up our younger days, to remember not just their fame, but their humanity. Because every legend has a story, and every story deserves to be told with respect. Thank you for listening. Until next time.